Today's gospel reading comes from the 28th chapter of Matthew, verses 1 to 15. After the Sabbath, as the first day of the week was dawning, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. And suddenly there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord, descending from heaven, came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothing white as snow. For fear of him, the guards shook and became like dead men. But the angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid. I know you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, for he has been raised, and as he said, come, see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples he has been raised from the dead, and indeed he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him. This is my message for you." So they left the tomb quickly with fear and great joy, and ran to tell his disciples. Suddenly Jesus met them and said, "Greetings." And they came to him, took hold of his feet, and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me." While they were going, some of the guard went into the city and told the chief priest everything that had happened. After the priests had assembled with the elders, they devised a plan to give a large sum of money to the soldiers, telling them, "You must say, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. If this comes to the governor's ears, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble." So they took the money and did as they were directed. And this story is still told among the Jews to this day. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Before I share my Easter Day message with you, I want to share something else with you. Something kind of special, I think very special. As you know, Easter Day is one of the 2 days of the Holy Year, the Christian year, that we normally have a cantata. And we had one planned, and Bruce was going to, our choral director, was going to be leading the cantata, and we had a number of musicians scheduled to come. They were reserved and scheduled to come to join us. And as things developed with the pandemic, we realized that we could not take that risk of having them come together and so many people come in to the sanctuary. We thought maybe what we would do is then maybe have a smaller representative number of musicians. But once again, as things got worse, worship committee realized that, again, it was taking too much risk for them to come in and play. And this church, which, very special church, paid the musicians. That means a lot to me. Anyway, what I was going to say is that Bruce's daughter, Elizabeth, is head of the local musicians union, and she sends her great appreciation for this church's willingness to pay the musicians when so many were not. And I think that's just something really special about Trinity. And it makes me treasure being here as your minister. So, thank you, Trinity. It was the right thing to do. And I'm so glad the church did it. According to the dictionary, the word reputation means the following. And this is the dictionary definition. The estimation in which a person or thing is held, especially by the community or the public generally. Even with the clarity of that definition, however, the accuracy of a person's reputation may be nowhere near the reality of that person's character. Sometimes reputation and character can be quite different from each other. And this is especially true for historical figures. In my research this past week, I came across an article on the web titled "Historical Figures Who Are Nothing Like the People They're Painted to Be." In other words, nothing like their reputations. Now, the list of historical figures was both interesting and, in some cases, somewhat surprising. For example, we hear the name Marie Antoinette. And what kind of reputation is associated with that name? Well, we can probably answer that. It is the reputation of this member of French royalty that was epitomized by the famous phrase, "Let them eat cake," supposedly spoken by Marie Antoinette as the poor of France begged the government to help them, to give them bread. But according to the article and other reliable historical sources, both the phrase and Marie Antoinette's notorious reputation were false. Let me quote the article to you directly. There's just one problem. She wasn't a villain at all. Marie Antoinette caught much of the blame from her angry subjects in the 1700s, partly because she was a foreign queen from Austria, and partly because she was a woman. The truth is, the queen was shipped away from home at the age of 14 to marry a king who didn't even speak her language. And she took unfair criticism for an entire aristocracy devoted to excess. Also, she never said, "Let them eat cake." That article, and others like it, have been published numerous times over the years. But even today, if one wants to talk about the excesses of the wealthy in any culture, all over the world, including ours, inevitably someone will use or write, or we will see the words, "Let them eat cake." Historians may rehabilitate a reputation in scholarly articles, but cultures have a funny way of clinging to historical misinterpretations and misperceptions. Also, even allowing them to become definitive, just as the name Marie Antoinette still defines wretched excess. While the chief priest of Jerusalem and the leaders of the city preceded Marie Antoinette by about 1,700 years, they certainly understood the power of reputation in human culture, and they would always use it to their advantage. In the Palestinian and Jewish cultures of the first century, reputation was literally the most important definition in the life of any individual or any group. As we might expect, the wealthy and the politically connected of Jerusalem, of Israel, of the whole Roman Empire were the ones who were held in highest esteem, but for very different reasons. And of course, we know that that esteem was not necessarily true or earned. In the Roman Empire, there existed a literal pyramid of personal repute, with the emperor at the capstone. And of course, if you knew something about the Roman emperors, they certainly did not deserve to be at the top of the pyramid of reputation. But they did. Then below them, just below them, the Senate, and then a tangle of positions below that, representing the remainder of the population, the plebeian nobility, landowners, the military, citizens of Rome, all the way down to the foreign and captured slaves, which made up the very base of that culture. Money and power were the defining factors that created the Roman pyramid. And one could literally bribe their way up the pyramid to the next ladder. That's how you got ahead in the Roman Empire. You bribed the next level up. You bribed your way up, and then you received a sponsor. However, bribery did not work in the Jewish cultural matrix of the first century, because the reputation of its citizens was built upon religion. And that was the case apart from any other factor. Now, of course, we're familiar with the 10 Commandments which God gave to Moses on Mount Sinai. And if we read other parts of Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, we will see additional laws which in total created the cultural matrix of Israel that I'm talking about. Now, those laws were written to apply equally to everyone, not just to every citizen of Israel, but everyone in the world. That is why we find Old Testament passages such as Leviticus 19:34, which explicitly describes how God wants God's people to treat aliens and sojourners who cross or who live within their boundaries. This is what Leviticus says. The alien who resides with you shall be to you as the citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord, your God. By the time we reach the 1st century AD, however, the cultural tradition of Israel had perverted or replaced those laws with their own interpretation of hierarchy, wrapped in a cloak of religious segregation. Gentiles were to be hated because they were despised by God. How do we know they were despised by God? Because they were born Gentiles. Samaritan Judaism was blasphemous, as were all Samaritans. In fact, if someone were traveling from Galilee to Judea, and they passed through the Transjordan, they would take the Transjordan was basically a desert. They would literally take miles around through the Transjordan to avoid going through the land of the Samaritans. They wouldn't even set foot in their land. That's how segregated they were. The poor, the weak, and the misfortunate suffered because of God's judgment against them or against their ancestors. Therefore, they were a curse upon the land. On the other hand, the powerful, the rich, the healthy, and the religious elite, according to them, had been given their status by God. Therefore, they alone were righteous. And being righteous, of course, they could judge. They could judge all that was unrighteous or blasphemous or a threat to their religion, which they so zealously guarded. It was from the power to make these kinds of judgments that the civic leaders of the city of Jerusalem and the religious leaders of the temple, the chief priests, plotted to bring about the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth. An execution they finally achieved. But do you recall how they achieved that execution? They did so by literally threatening Pilate, the provincial governor, with the charge of sedition for coddling a traitor if he intended to release Jesus and keep him from being crucified. They would report him to the Roman Empire. That was the only way they could get him to the cross. But just getting Jesus to the cross was not enough. The fledgling movement that Jesus had started, first in Galilee, then Judea, and then finally that had grown in Jerusalem, that itself also had to be crushed. It had to be destroyed completely. And what better way to do so than to create the lowest of reputations for those, the apostles, the disciples, anyone who had attached themselves to Christ, anyone who had claimed that Christ was the promised Messiah. In the last chapter of Matthew, we see the plot of Jesus' conspirators unfold. So they left the tomb quickly with fear and great joy and ran to tell his disciples. These are the women that came that morning. Suddenly, Jesus met them and said, "Greetings." And they came to him, took hold of his feet, and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me." If criminals were at the bottom of the Jewish religious hierarchy, and therefore, according to the religious leaders, the group that God hated the most, grave robbers were certainly the lowest of criminals. Dead bodies and all of the hygienic hazards associated with them were anathema to the purity laws of Judaism. And they had many of these purity laws. We might recall that in Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan, you might remember that story. Even a severely injured person just lying in the road, alive, was conspicuously avoided by the religious leaders who went to the other side of the road. Why? Simply because that person may be close to death. And they wouldn't dare contaminate themselves by being around someone when they died. That was the attitude. When the body of Jesus was lowered from the cross and placed in the garden tomb, the grave of Joseph Arimathea, it was hastily anointed with spices to avoid the smell of decay, then wrapped in linen cloths. The reason that the women came to the tomb on the morning of the third day was not to greet the risen Christ, but to complete the elaborate rituals of body preservation required by their religious laws. Just before the resurrection, Matthew tells us that the religious elite who had plotted the crucifixion begged Pilate to seal the tomb and place a watch of Roman guards around it. "Sir, we remember what that impostor said while he was still alive. After 3 days I will rise again. Therefore, command that the tomb be made secure until the third day. Otherwise, his disciples may go and steal him away, rob his grave, and tell the people he has been raised from the dead. And the last deception would be worse than the first." The assumption of these Jewish leaders that anyone who followed Jesus was a liar and a grave robber was simply astonishing. And it reflects their absolute desperation in making sure that Jesus, however they could do it, stayed dead. But as we know, and it's the reason we're here today, things just didn't work out for them the way that they had planned. Some of the guard went into the city, this is after the day after the resurrection, and told the chief priest everything that had happened. After the priest had assembled with the elders, they devised a plan here goes another conspiracy, to give a large sum of money to the soldiers, telling them, you must say, his disciples came by night and stole him away, while we, the guards, were asleep. So the guards took the money and did as they were directed. And Matthew concludes this part by saying, and this story is still told among the Jews to this day. Now, in one way, the chief priests and conspirators were absolutely correct. There was a grave robbery that early morning at the Garden Tomb. But it was a robbery not perpetrated by Jesus' followers. It was Jesus himself who robbed the grave. And it was not his grave that he robbed, but ours. Our graves. According to Matthew, who writes his gospel about 37 years after the event, the story that Jesus' body had been stolen, that his followers had robbed his grave, had violated the most egregious way, the purification laws. That story was still circulating at the time Matthew wrote his gospel. This story is told among the Jews to this day. But you and I know that there was another story circulating in Matthew's time. A story told by Matthew himself, told by Mark and Luke and John and Mary Magdalene and Mary and Martha and Peter and Paul and all those, the countless others, who knew a different story and knew that story to be the truth. It was not a story about body snatching, but a story of salvation. It was not a story of death, but a story of life. And that story, 2,000 years later, is the one that is still circulating to this day. It is the one that we celebrate together with Christians all over the world this morning. It is the true story. In describing the meaning of Easter, theologian and author N.T. Wright uses what I think are the perfect words. And I invite you to hear them with your heart. Listen to what he writes. Jesus' resurrection is the beginning of God's new project, not to snatch people away from earth to heaven, but to colonize earth with the life of heaven. Isn't that a beautiful thought? To colonize earth with the life of heaven. Easter was when hope in person surprised the whole world by coming forward from the future into the present. The message of Easter is that God's new world has been unveiled in Jesus Christ, and that you are now invited to belong to. That is such a beautiful and pure definition of Easter. As you and I gather this morning, God's great grave robber invites us to join him in that task, the task of bringing new life into a decaying world, a world filled with graves, a world in which more are being dug every day. The Apostle Paul understood Christ's invitation, an invitation which Paul himself explained and shared with the Christians in the church of Corinth when he wrote this to them. For this perishable body must put on imperishability, and this mortal body must put on immortality. When this perishable body puts on imperishability, and this mortal body puts on immortality, then the saying that is written will be fulfilled. Death has been swallowed up in victory. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? Christ's conspirators tried to destroy his reputation by ruining the reputation of his followers, of those who believed in him, calling them grave robbers. Little did they know, those conspirators, that that reputation is not only our task, we who believe in Christ, it is our call. It is what we do as Christians. We are called to rob the grave of death and darkness by sharing the good news of light and love, the news that sent the women running from the tomb out into the world. The good news that should set our feet toward places of service and compassion, worship, and hope. The words, the story that still stand today and will stand for all time until Christ returns. Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. And what is our response? May we be grave robbers. May we be grave robbers indeed. And share that new life with all the world. Jesus is risen. Alleluia.